Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles. And if you are new to the show, new to the channel, please hit the like, please hit the subscribe, definitely please hit the bell, as we are constantly adding new programming to the channel. I want you to be alerted whenever we launch a new show, as we're trying to do a lot of new things here in 2022. So, without any further ado, I know my co-host in particular put this show together. Tease Pascal a lot on this show. There's a lot of Pascal teasing. And I want to bring up two very important points. I want you guys to really listen to me good. Number one, Pascal put this show together. This is something he's been wanting to do. So I will be taking a huge backseat on this show, which I don't mind doing. And number two, Jean Bajlan started a survey on Twitter, and don't believe the hype with Pascal winning, being the leftist of all of us, the most left. He's the meanest of all of us. So without any further ado, let me bring in my homie, my dog, my co-host, the man of the Mau Mau Hour, who, while is very left, may not be the furthest, the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat, peace and greetings to the audience, peace and greetings, Jason Miles. What is this poll that Gene did? What is it?
You didn't see it?
No.
Oh, damn. I just messed everything up then.
What did he do?
So, I don't know. You didn't see it. I feel like you didn't see it.
I didn't see it.
Someone had put a comment somewhere on Reddit somewhere that Gene saw, or maybe it was Discord. I can't remember. Maybe it was even the comment section. I can't remember. It was one of those things like, who's the most left out of the TIR crew out of the four of us, right?
Uh-huh.
And they said it was me and Gene.
They said it was the most left was
me and Gene. Whatever. Who cares? Do you get a prize, Nick? No,
I'm just saying. I was like, that's interesting. So
Gene thought it was funny, and then he put a poll on Twitter. Who is the most left? And it was funny. So when I saw you were winning by leaps and bounds. You were 65% ahead of the curve. So I did Ben Burge's call-in show today, which is actually kind of interesting. The whole call-in thing is kind of cool. And someone called in and asked that question: who's the most left of us? Because Ben chimed in on that.
Ben chimed in on who's left on.
He gave a very, very, very logical Ben answer. He's like, they're all to the left of this, and they all do this. And it could ultimately, it's a silly question. I mean, I don't think Jean Bajlan asked it seriously.
That's interesting.
It is silly, but people say that we've been hyping the show. I don't know if we've necessarily been hyping the show. It's just that, let me say this. Just for who we are and what we do, there is some pushback that sometimes we get, especially in the Black community, because of some of the stances that we have, especially when it comes to a unified Black experience.
There is no Black community.
I was recently interviewed, and somehow we got into a discussion of this on the interview, and it was a lot of like, I was like, I don't think it's unified. I don't think we're a permanent underclass. So also, as I'm getting into this discussion, I've been reading our guest's book.
2 books.
I only read one.
I know. I understand you read one. He has to. I'm just saying.
He has multiple. Brother's got articles. We're gonna get into all that. Do you want to read bio?
No, man, go ahead.
Jesus Christ. So part of this show, part of what we always do, I mean, we had a whole show talking about the enslavement of Native Americans before 1619. So, these narratives aren't as simple as some would like to believe. So I know Pascal has a lot of interrogating, as he says. I know our guest is ready to drop some facts. and I'm ready to try to respond to the chat because I'm sure that ADOS is snuck in, and you know how that goes.
Let them come in.
So our guest is Warren Eugene Miltier Jr. He is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2014. His publications include 2 academic books, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South, and North Carolina's Free People of Color. Please welcome, yes, Dr. Warren Miltier. Oops.
Hello, everybody.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Dr. Warren Miltier, I want to thank you for coming on our show for Black History Month. You are not our first Black guest, but you are the first one officially talking about history for this Black History Month.
We have more
Well,
Black people on this month?
Jacqueline was talking.
Is she the only Black person we had on?
What about, didn't we have Eugene Puryear?
Is that in February?
I don't remember. It all becomes a blur.
Yes.
But we contact each other via social media on Twitter, and I don't know if I had stated. I think I saw you or your work, and I was asking if you cover certain topics on Free People of Color, and you were like, "Yeah, check out my work." And I got your books on Kindle, and I was like, "Man, this guy, his scholarship is pretty much off the meat racks." I was very impressed with the level of intricacy with your academic work and everything. So to get, let's start tabula rasa, assuming no one knows about this subject. Define the concept or the term free people of color.
Yeah, so free people of color, just to give you a simple version of it, are people who were of African and or Native American descent who were free in the period in which slavery was legal here in the United States, but there also were free people of color in other parts of the world as well. But it's a category that's used during periods in which slavery is legal.
Okay. So basically, free people of color are people who are Black and or Native American or have some admixture thereof that are
Right.
free during the period of slavery within the context of the United States. So we're talking about free people of color within the context of the United States, because many of our guests who know, we've talked about this subject in the Haitian context, and we have different names for them: affranchis, gens de couleur, et cetera, so on. But we're not trying to confuse the two different contexts today. Okay. Can you tell our audience how what are the first periods of time, first of all, that free people of color become a noticeable phenomenon in the North American context?
Well, I mean, there are definitely free people of color in the areas of North America that are going to become the United States in the 1500s, if we're thinking about Spanish Florida. Uh, but after that, if you're thinking more about the English colonies, and by the 1600s, there's a presence of free people of color. And of course, this is messy because, again, as I define free people of color, it can include people who have Native American descent. So, of course, the Native Americans are already here, but they're not being necessarily viewed as free people of color in, say, the 1600s, whereas many of them will be categorized in that way in the late 1700s and early 1800s.
Okay. Did the free people of color in the earlier iterations develop enough numbers to create communities of themselves?
So yes and no. In some places, I'm thinking about maybe like colonial Virginia in the 1700s. There are clusters of free people of color who are marrying among themselves and creating something that you might consider a community, although those boundaries are very permeable. There are people coming in and out of those categories very early on and out of those groupings. But yeah, I mean, are free people of color who marry other free people of color and start this multi-generational network of families that are end up being very much intermixed in the colonial period. But then at the same time, you also have other free people of color who may be formerly enslaved, and there are not many other free people of color around, and so they're associating with the enslaved population or with white servants. Um, so something like that.
Can you talk a little bit about the white servant class as well? I know you talk about that a lot in your book, and the intermingling of these free people of color and the different categories that these people sat in. It wasn't just free people of color; there was also class divisions and categories amongst them too, right?
Right. Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, you've got free people of color who many of them are servants or poor people, and many of those families that appear in the 1600s, 1700s period are actually descendants of the white servant class. So what happens is that um, in most southern colonies, if your mother is free, you are free. And so the easiest way to become a free person is to have a white mother. And many of the white women who give birth to children of color are poor women who are in servitude, who are living next to enslaved Native American people, enslaved African people, and they're having children with those people. And as a result, you end up with these early generations of free people of color in places like colonial Maryland, colonial Virginia, North Carolina, etc.
Well, this is really important, and I really want us to kind of to really reemphasize that is that what you're saying is that contrary to the kind of very binary image of the slavery period that we have, that all black people were under the lash and all white people were free and most white people owned slaves. It's much more complicated than that, and there is a period in the early era, 1700s particularly, where you actually have white women who were poor who would who would intentionally, volitionally have sexual relations with black men who may have been slaves or people of color and had children with them. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely what's going on. Because I mean, they're in proximity to these people. They're creating relationships like people who are close together often do, and that's what happens is they're having children, and then these children create. Sometimes they end up in the servant class, sometimes they don't, and there's a gender aspect to that. So in the colonial period, in many colonies, if you are a servant woman and you have children out of wedlock, which most of these children are born out of wedlock because their unions are not legal under the colonial laws, um, those children end up being forced into servitude as well. So the mothers are servants, then the children are servants, and the periods of servitude can go up into your early 30s. So this is a time where people aren't living very long. Your best life is going on when you're a teenager and when you're in your 20s, and after that, everything is kind of falling apart. So yeah, they're what happens basically is you have multiple generations of people stuck in servitude, especially women, because women can be punished, children out of wedlock, and then once their children are born, those children are forced into servitude as well, and the same rules apply. And so you see the cycle over and over and over again in certain families. Of course, there are some individuals who are able to get out of this cycle, but there are also many that are stuck. And so I've found examples where you'll see a family that starts off in servitude in say the early 1700s, and they're still there 100 years later.
Now, when you say servitude, servitude is distinct from slavery. Is that correct?
Right, exactly. Servitude is distinct from slavery. Slavery is supposed to be for life. Servitude has a set term usually, and it can vary from uh, a few years all the way up to, like I said, it could be 30 years of servitude. Um, and in that situation, you have certain rights that an enslaved person would not have. You don't have the same privileges as somebody who's not a servant, but at the same time, you're not an enslaved person. So, for instance, if you are a servant and the person that you're working for abuses you, you can go to court and complain about that. Whereas if you're an enslaved person, you don't have that right in 99% of cases to go and
Well,
complain and say, "Hey, this guy's beating me." You can't do that.
can we talk about that for a second? Because I think that really, you know, complicates the narrative, and we want to also say that we of course understand it wasn't everybody. Um, so you're saying that if you are in the servant class and not enslaved, you can complain about your master to a judge.
Yeah,
How would it work?
yeah, you could go to a local official or court and file a complaint and say this person is abusing me. Or you'll see complaints where um, these masters are trying to blur the line between servitude and slavery. And
Mhm.
so, say you're supposed to be a servant for 30 years. Your master might try to keep you for a longer period. So you would go to court and complain and say, "Hey, I'm not a slave. This person's trying to hold me as a slave, and I want to get out of this situation." And then the court would look for evidence and try to figure out whether you're indeed a free person or slave. And if you're a free person, you would be granted your freedom and maybe even damages for the abuse that took place during that time.
So there were situations where actually slaves did win some sort of monetary damages in shillings. I think when I was reading your book, I saw a lot of
Yeah, yeah,
payouts in
yeah,
shillings.
yeah. There's definitely servants. Yeah, servants would have potentially have gotten some restitution.
Yeah, servants and slaves are not the same thing, and I want to really harp on that distinction. Number one, there are white people who can be servants. Is that correct?
Absolutely,
All right.
absolutely.
Now, how long does a period of servitude exist in America? When does that stop in American history?
So, I mean, there are various forms of servitude going throughout the period study up to 1865. But you can argue that we still have servitude in certain forms. I mean, if you want to look at what's happening in prisons, I mean, I think you could argue that there is a connection between this process of servitude that we see in the colonial period and the way that people are used as hired labor um, in prisons today or in other settings.
Now, I want to. Were the majority of the people in servitude white or free people of color? Were they mostly white?
That's hard to say. In the colonial period, I would say yeah, the majority of them are white people for sure. But as time goes on and we get closer to the Revolution, um, enslaved people are replacing a lot of the white servants. They're still there, but they're not as common as they were, say, in the 1600s or early 1700s.
But there's a presence of servitude of free people of color servitude and white servitude going well into the 1800s.
Oh yeah, definitely. And see, what's happening is there's this system of apprenticeship that exists throughout this time period. So apprenticeship is where a child is um, put under a master to learn a trade, basically by the court usually, and that's something that could have applied to white children or free children of color. And what's happening is that they're basically operating as servants. But they're supposed to receive something in exchange for their term of servitude. And there, as we get into the 1800s, there are more and more laws explaining exactly what a master needs to provide an apprentice as restitution for their service and their work. So it might be education, and we see this in the South later in the 1800s, where free people of color.
Did he freeze?
I think he froze.
Oh no. Oh no. Deep state. Deep state
This is
got him.
getting good, man.
Warren, deep state got you. Damn, ADOS. Not even deep state. ADOS got it.
You lost deep state. Did we lose? I hope we didn't lose him.
I think ADOS went ahead and got him. They're like, we can't let this narrative get out. It was a Darity. Darity sent his goons.
Um, what should we do?
Jana says ADOS sounds like a malevolent AI. Let's try to hit him back up. Let me try one thing. Hold on. Let me try one thing. Pascal, be charming.
Yes, so now we're having a conversation about what is fascinating about this right. And guys, I want you to know this. I was reading Warren's book, and I know the subject of the show is free people of color. But what I found fascinating, yeah, you phrased out for a little bit, Warren. What I found fascinating about your book, Warren, I was about to announce to the audience, is that yes, the show is originally about free people of color, but the various ways of oppressive labor extraction of white people who were not slaves was fascinating as hell to me, quite honestly, because I mean I knew about a few people of color and I knew about the class of '60s, but I didn't know any of this about the length of servitude that white people were served. I did not know that poor white women could have their children taken to work in servitude like black women would have their child slaves taken from them and forced into bondage. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, what you're seeing is that the oppression that this early generation of free people of color is facing is a result of lawmakers in the colonies trying to control white women and their sexuality. Um, and so, we don't think about that link between these poor white women and the free people of color, but that's exactly what's going on here. Um,
Wow.
Pascal, did you see this comment on the screen?
I discovered patriarchy as a political economy. No, I didn't discover patriarchy. I just did not know about the actual way in which the thing that got me the labor the different iterations of labor context was fascinating, but the fact that poor women and it wasn't a rarity. They would often they would take their kids if they were either divorced or they were economically indigent, and they would like sell the white women. They would sell the kids off to indentured servitude or bonded labor.
yeah, yeah.
How long does that happen in America? Like, when does that stop?
Well, again, I mean, there are instances of this going on um, up through the Civil War where the children are taken away because part of the problem is that single women, widowed women don't have the same legal rights to their children as men do. And that's across race lines. So if you are a poor white woman, whether it's 1750 or 1850, and the court wants to take away your kids, they can. And so what happens is, if you're well connected, you can create an arrangement where that doesn't happen. But if you're somebody who's not well connected, then it's more likely that your kids are going to be taken away. And again, if you're a white woman who's having children of color, then certain people may see that as a problem and want to take your kids away as well. The only thing that would prevent them from doing this again goes back to money, right? So if if the court can see that you can take care of your kids in some way or support your kids, or it might become a burden on the community to take away your kids, then they'll let you keep your kids. But if somebody else can make money off your kids, then there's a greater possibility that they would want to take your children away and give them to somebody else.
And these are not just black women; these are white women as well.
Right. Yeah. And you see that, like I said, throughout the time period. Although I would say that the closer we get to the 1860s and the Civil War, uh, the servitude and apprenticeship system seems to target uh, free people of color at a disproportionate level in certain places. So again, not everywhere, but you do see that pattern in certain
Yeah.
So,
places.
So
as
someone's
a
asking.
historian,
Oh, sorry.
I'm
Go ahead.
sorry.
I'm sorry.
As a historian, I want to ask you this. I want to be very blunt, straight up, and I want your thoughts. Don't you think this complicates the narrative of history being promoted with the 1619 project?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's definitely complicated. I mean, first of all, the part of like 1619 erases the Spanish experience, and the connection of free people of color, and how Spanish Florida and Louisiana tie into this larger picture. It's kind of left out of the story in that sense. Um, yeah, I mean, of course, and I would say that the 1619 project, at least in this original iteration, was not designed to be holistic and tell all these details. I think that's something. It's when you come up with these narratives of like, this is what Black history is, from 1619 to the present, or however you want to frame it. They're going to be stories that get left out, and this is one story that tends to get left out because it doesn't fit easily in a lot of narratives around the
Well, the
topic.
narrative of slavery for a lot of us is roots.
Right.
And
And
this
even
really dispels that whole, I got to look at LeVar Burton totally differently now. You understand?
yeah, I mean, I, I think for a lot of people, it's really hard to get their minds around this type of situation because we're just not familiar with it. Like you said, it's not portrayed in the movies. Many historians don't pay it a lot of attention. But if you look at the statistics, it's actually an important story for the history of Black people in the United States, and people beyond just Black people in the United States. I mean, there are a lot of descendants of free people of color who are white people, Native American people, and identify in that way as well. I mean,
And
and I'm
I
not talking about just
also, as we kind of always talk here about, the unified Black experience and, racial democracy over
Social democracy.
social democracy. As this narrative gets lost and we constantly promote the more 1619 narrative, how is forgetting this past harmful in your opinion?
well, I mean, if you forget it, you don't understand the reality that we come from. If you don't understand the reality that we come from, how are you going to figure out how we got to where we are today and how we're going to go towards the future? Um, yeah, it doesn't make sense. The present doesn't make sense without understanding the complicated nature of the past.
I mean, does it back up the notion that there's just a permanent Black underclass when you forget this whole history?
If you forget, I mean, probably yes and no, depending on how you want to look at it. I mean, it depends. Again, it's like what aspect of the experience of free people of color do you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about the free people of color who were stuck in the servant class? Or do you want to also look at those free people of color who were more successful, who had trades, who had businesses, who owned land, and the connections that they have to the present? Because I mean, there are people who are descendants of free people of color who obtained, their ancestors obtained property back in this period that I'm talking about, the 1700s, 1800s. They still have it today. So yeah,
And that narrative actually gets kind of messed up too, because I think it was the Atlantic did a story maybe 4 or 5 years ago talking about the amount of money that these Black farmers mostly had lost collectively over time. I think it was in the, if not hundreds of billions, maybe the trillions of dollars, the land they lost. And again, it's kind of told as a flat, well, since these people lost it, everyone lost it. And you're saying, of course that happened, but there's also people that did get to keep their land and had generational wealth because of it.
yeah, definitely. There are definitely people who have benefited from generational wealth. And I mean, you just think about the concept of like sharecropping, which is part of this standard narrative, right? Like you're not part of that narrative if you own your own land, even if you don't have much. If you own your own land, that's puts you and gives you a huge advantage, and what you can do for your family, what you can do for future generations.
So the question I want to ask, right, is like, let's actually get to the free people of color communities because we're about halfway through. Is that talk to us about the different types of class standing that exist among free people of color? So we have free people of color, and we have a period in which large numbers of black people are slaves. What percentage of black people overall were free people of color in various periods of time?
So it's kind of difficult to figure that out in the colonial period, but by the time we get to the breakout of the Civil War, we're talking about a little bit over 10%, because
Okay.
you've got uh, the North where most people of color are free, and then you've got a slightly larger population of people in the South that are free. So just to throw out the numbers, we're talking about 500,000 free people of color by 1860, and about 4 million people who were enslaved in 1860.
Okay, so by the breakout period of the Civil War, we have 10% of the black population are free people of color. Now, some of those could have been recently freed folk, but by that time, there's some of them that have been multi generational free people of color as well. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. So you've got some that come out of that colonial period and have connections to that, and then you have people who have been more recently freed. Because in the northern states, you have a process of eliminating slavery there that starts in the late 1700s and goes into the early 19th century. And then you also have some people in the South as well who obtain their freedom in that late 1700s, early 1800s period. And so they are supplementing that existing population of free people of color that came about in the 1600s and 1700s.
Now, one of the things from a phenotypical point of view, were most free people of color generally of some mixed race heritage? In other words, were they more proximate to phenotypical whiteness than the majority of black slaves?
They're disproportionately so, but I mean, the only information we have is census data. So the census of 1860 and 1850 actually categorized people as black or mulatto, and mulatto was suggested these are people who have some kind of mixed ancestry. And depending on where you are, so if you're in a state like Maryland, Virginia, these are also places where there tended to be more enslaved people who ended up becoming free before slavery ended. You're going to see probably on average a free person of color might be darker. Whereas if you get into the deep South in places like Charleston, New Orleans, um, you're less likely to see that, and the people are tend to be uh, people who have some mixed ancestry. But it's very difficult to actually judge that from the information we have, because when people are deciding whether somebody's mixed or not, they're just looking at them and saying, "Hey, this person fits in this box or that box."
What states generally had larger populations of free people of color?
So in the United States as a whole, Maryland had the largest population, followed by Virginia, which are places that a lot of people who know about this topic don't tend to think about when they think about free people of color. But those are the states with the largest populations, followed by North Carolina, Delaware, um, Louisiana as far as the South goes, and then the North, Pennsylvania, New York, later Ohio had pretty large populations of free people of color. And we're talking about tens of thousands of people.
So let's talk about the free people of color who were the elites, who had wealth, who had land and property. How did they acquire it? What percentage of people of color would that be? And then we're going to get into the question of their ownership of slaves.
Yeah, so I mean, overall, it's a relatively small population of people who we would describe as wealthy, and they tend to be disproportionately situated in the deep South, places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, because of course that's where all the money's being made in the 1800s before the end of the Civil War, because of the expansion of slavery and taking over land. And so this is where people who want to speculate and get rich go. And that goes for free people of color. Now, how they get wealthy, some of them inherit their wealth from, say, a white father who was a planter. That's not uncommon. You have some free people of color who are tradespeople and are really good at business and successful, and they are able to buy land, buildings, and of course other people.
So now, being I'm Haitian American, as you know that. Now, the Creole phenomenon in Louisiana, from what I understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there's a correlation between Haitian elites or affranchis or mulattoes who left Haiti that came to Louisiana, New Orleans. Some came with actual black or African slaves who basically created or interface with the Creole community in Louisiana. Can you talk a little bit about that and the truth or maybe incorrectness of that, if I'm incorrect?
No, that I mean a lot of that fits perfectly with what I've seen. So there is an existing population of free people before the Haitian Revolution that exists in New Orleans, and many of those people have ties to the Caribbean already because of Louisiana's status as a colony, first as a French colony, and later as a Spanish colony. Of course, there are French and Spanish colonies in the Caribbean as well, and so. During the revolution, you have an exodus of people from Saint Domingue, which of course becomes Haiti, and those people, many of them go to Cuba and then end up in Louisiana and other parts of the United States as well. And then some of them are also coming directly to Louisiana, and like you said, they're bringing uh, enslaved people with them if they happen to be slaveholders, and they I've seen petitions where they'll ask for permission to bring their slaves into a certain state or city, and so yeah, they're definitely helping to augment this wealthy class of free people of color.
Okay, and now does that mean that in Louisiana, because in Haiti, the free people of color or the Affranchi, they owned at one point 25% of the black African slaves. Do we see in Louisiana or the Louisiana territories that larger numbers of free people of color are owning African slaves commercially?
Yeah, so in Louisiana compared to other states, yeah, there's a higher percentage of free people of color who are slaveholders compared to say somewhere like Virginia. Um,
What are the
yeah.
states that were high in terms of free people of color owning slaves?
So as far as raw numbers are concerned, I would say again it's probably places like South Carolina, Louisiana. Um, these are places where, of course, slavery is central to the economy and is in becoming more so central to the economy. And again, that's also part of why you have these free people of color leaving the Caribbean coming to Louisiana. These are places where um, this that kind of behavior, owning other people, is acceptable. It's expanding. I mean, New Orleans is the largest slave trading market in the country at one point, so they fit in pretty well down there. Whereas Virginia, Maryland, although they have larger populations of free people of color, part of the reason they have larger populations of free people of color is that to a certain extent it's not as beneficial economically to necessarily enslave people in certain areas of those states. You can't make the same money in 19th century Virginia in certain areas as you can in Louisiana, where all this land is being taken away from Native American people and opened up for settlement. And also, you've got this port city, New Orleans, that is not just a hub for the United States, but is an international trade center for the country as well.
Wow. Okay. So let's talk about the different nature of the slave ownership among free people of color. What percentage of them, or were there many of them that were large plantation owners?
Uh, no, no, this is a really small population. I can't give you a percentage per se. I would, it's not 10%. We're talking about single digits or less as
Okay.
far as number of people who are doing that. And, I guess I should add into the conversation as well. When we're talking about free people of color who are slaveholders, that you have some free people of color who are slaveholders for profit, and you also have free people of color who are enslaving their own family members. because what happens is in certain southern states, as we get into the 19th century, they make it more and more difficult for people who are enslaved to become free legally. And so, if you are a free person who has enslaved family members, the easiest way to protect them is to actually enslave them yourself versus having somebody else enslave them.
And what I found interesting, based on literature, I recently acquired Carter G. Woodson's work on free people of color slave owners. How do you evaluate his scholarship on that? He has data and numbers.
Yeah, so um, not long after that book came out, there was a problem that discovered by some historians that apparently he counted some people as free people of color who were actually white. And
Oh
so
wow.
some of the people who are listed in his book aren't actually free people of color. So it kind of throws off his numbers, um, and especially in cases where you have like people who were pretty large slaveholders. Some of those people aren't actually free people of color, and that's just
Okay.
because the raw data is very sloppy, and he just missed some things.
Okay. Okay. Good. But so there were very small numbers of free people of color who were large plantation owners.
Right? Yeah.
To what numbers of slaves would you categorize as large plantation owners?
I mean, most people in the profession would say over 20 if you own over 20 people. Um, I mean, I would say that hey, if you own 10 people, that's a lot because I mean, if you think about it from this perspective, that an enslaved person is about the equivalent value of a car. Now, of course, we have a range of values for cars, and you would have a range of values for people too. But if you own 10 adult people, you're not poor. You're pretty well to do person. But there are, in the United States, by the time we get to the Civil War, there are individuals who own hundreds of enslaved people. So you don't see large numbers of free people of color owning hundreds of people. That's not common at all. But it's definitely not uncommon, especially in places like South Carolina and Louisiana, for them to own a few dozen or more. There are people who own 100. That's not unheard of.
Were free people of color who commercially owned slaves known to be as brutal as white slaves? Was there almost no differentiation in treatment and attitude towards enslavement?
Yeah, I would say that there's some strong evidence for that.
So
Definitely.
that the notion of racial kinship being a barrier to looking at the slave as property didn't exist.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've found runaway ads in newspapers posted by free people of color trying to recover the people they're enslaving. They sell people.
Whoa!
Yeah. I mean, that's a thing. So
Did you want that to be the cover of your book, and the publisher was like, "Oh, we just are not ready for Van Jones to come down on us with the list mob."
Now, in terms of the free people of color, right? What was that? How was the class social standing amongst themselves? Did they try to, the social cultural behavior? Did they try to replicate European or Western aesthetics, values? Did they maintain any Africanisms? Were they basically just white people with a tan who owned property? Like, I mean, like, what was the actual kind of socio-cultural behavior? What kind of religious services did they have? Did they have separate churches? Did they have their own particular preferential version of Christianity that they liked as opposed to other blacks who were slaves?
yeah, I mean, you would have had all of that. So you had some free people of color who may have been, say, we'll just roughly say middle or upper class. They're going to try to stick with other people of their same background, go to churches of that same background. And you do have some free people of color who are attending churches that are majority free people of color. You have some who might be attending churches with white people and enslaved people, or with enslaved people and just free people of color. Part of the problem for them in certain periods is that having enslaved people in churches with free people of color without white supervision is considered illegal. So if they're doing that, they're doing it out in the woods somewhere. Um, but yeah, you've got everything under the sun because you have some free people of color who were born in Africa, were enslaved, brought here, and became free. And then you have these other free people of color who have white fathers, maybe even white grandfathers, and all in their physical appearance would look like white people, but in their community they're known not to be white people, um, and are treated as free people of color because of that. And so yeah, they're these people are not going to all see themselves as the same, even in this time period. And of course, after the Civil War, it gets even more complicated because this category of free people of color doesn't necessarily all the people who fall into that category don't necessarily end up being considered black people.
Wow. So there's a correlation of some people who are free people of color who, after emancipation, kind of end up passing into whiteness.
Yeah, you've got people passing into whiteness, people who are categorized as Indians in their communities and not as black. So yeah, you've got a whole variety of things going on. And then you have some free people of color who are not necessarily categorized differently, but they still value the fact that their ancestors were free during the period of slavery. And they tend to
Someone said,
associate with only people who have that background.
someone said something interesting. I think it was Shirley. Can you talk about the level of colorism that existed among free people of color, and the role that played in? I'm interested in the class stratification and how they viewed themselves relative to the black slave population in those factors.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot of evidence about the color issue. The best that we have is that there are a couple of societies that seem to have existed where um, the members tended to be people of mixed ancestry. But the trick with that is they're living in communities where most of the free people of color are of mixed ancestry, anyways. So, to what degree are they discriminating based on status versus color? It's hard to distinguish. Um, but they're definitely drawing lines of distinction when it comes to ancestral background. Um, I talk about a case in one of my books where there are free people of color during the Civil War trying to get into the good graces of the now so-called Confederate officials, and so
Hmm.
they're proclaiming that their shared whiteness brings them together in a sense because they have white ancestors and the people who run the government are white people too.
Were
So
there any pro Confederate free people of color?
there are definitely free people of color who are willing to do business with the Confederate government and to support it or support like Confederate regiments financially. And some of these people are among the slaveholding class of free people of color, so they have an interest in maintaining the system to some extent. And also, I mean, they're in a situation where these are the people you do business with. Are you going to alienate the people you do business with over the idea of maintaining union? And no, that's not how they're thinking about it. They're thinking about money, and so they're going to do what
Mm.
makes them money.
It's interesting that you bring this up. I worked in the Gulf of Mexico. I spent a lot of time, enough time, in southern Louisiana, and I don't know how well you know that area, Warren. Um, but there's a term. I don't know if you've ever heard it. It's a very Louisiana term called coon ass.
No, I haven't heard that one
You're not
before.
familiar with the term? It's generally a darker skinned white person who was supposed to be of some sort of native ancestry. But I remember I worked with this one guy who was almost as dark as me, curly hair. He had green eyes. He kind of looked like a lighter black dude. And we were talking one day, and I just assumed he was a black dude. He goes, "Oh no, I'm white." And I was like, "You're shitting me, right?" He goes, "No, no, 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 no." He's like, "I'm white." And he then went on, and he was about my age, and he went on to tell me that they had even in his high school days in the '90s, uh, mixed segregated proms, and he went to the white prom. And he wasn't an anomaly at all. There was definitely a lot of people that I met down there that were extremely dark, crazy kinky hair. And they'd be like, no, 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 I'm white. So it sounds like what you're saying is there's a lot of people that kind of latched on to the idea that they are not, there's no African black heritage in them whatsoever. It's just possibly Native American.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely people like that. Absolutely.
I wanted to ask you about a phenomenon. I've heard about this phenomenon because this is your specialty, and I'd like you to verify if it was true, if it was not true. Uh, have you heard of the phenomenon of plaçage and quadroon and octoroon balls?
Yeah,
Balls? Oh,
Quad ball like a dance.
gotcha.
right.
Quadroon and octoroon balls
Gotcha.
and plaçage. Can you talk about what plaçage and quadroon and octoroon balls were?
Yeah, so Passage is basically this idea that um, white men go to quadroon balls and they pick up free women of color and keep them as concubines, and that this is like a common practice. It's associated, or it's an idea that's associated with Louisiana. Um, and it's thought of as basically like a financial arrangement more. That's the emphasis there. And there's a lot of debate back and forth between historians about to what degree this is true. Because for one, there are relationships between white men and free women of color across the country. It's not just in Louisiana. Um, and to what degree these relationships are exploitative or not exploitative, it's going to vary. You have some people who are in marriage-like relationships, but they can't be married because it's illegal. And then you have other situations where there may be some type of financial incentive, um, but that's not basically this whole process of the quadroon ball is not central to the development of free people of color in Louisiana and their freedom and the way that they end up with wealth. I think that that's where the mythology comes in.
Okay,
Is
because the reason I asked, I don't know about the quadroon ball aspect in the Haitian context, but plaçage definitely existed in Haiti, and without a doubt, and it was a kind of quasi contractual relationship. It wasn't a marriage, but it was kind of like a common law marriage, and the women, the mixed race women who would engage in plaçage was negotiate property rights, inheritance rights, guaranteed freedom for their children, so on and so forth. Did that similar phenomenon exist in Louisiana and other states? Because I also read that they were plaçage existed in states not only limited to Louisiana.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely people who like enslaved women who would negotiate for freedom of their children. That's not unheard of. It's not going to be under that terminology, but it happens, sure, and they will end up with the inherited wealth of the white man who is creating this family or whatever. Yeah, that's definitely something that happens across the country, different periods of time. Yeah.
But also in free people of color societies, this would happen also because there seems to be a proclivity of the white males having preference for the free women of color who were more aesthetically in line with proximity to whiteness. Is that true or not true?
Well, what's basically happening, especially at certain times, is that there is a demographic imbalance. So you have, especially in the context of Haiti, but other places as well, where there are um, a larger number of free women of color versus free men of color, and there are larger numbers of white men versus white women. And so, because of that imbalance, you're going to have some of these relationships pop up for that reason. Um, but who are these? The white men having relationships with? I mean, they're having relationships with women of all backgrounds because I mean that's how these free people of color who end up light in the first place come from. They have to start somewhere. Where there's a woman who is an African who's having children with a white man in order to get these families started, and through the generations, yeah, you might have families that are lighter. etc. But to what
Well, I
degree
want
that
to ask
is,
you. I want to ask your professional opinion as a historian, as a scholar.
yeah.
Do you think that there is a capacity that there are sexual relationships with either, I can't be with slaves, with free women of color that were consensual with white men and negotiated on terms where they were participating in negotiation? In other words, all of these interactions were not necessarily rape. Would that be correct or incorrect?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, definitely. That's definitely
I
true.
wouldn't make that argument with because a slave can have no choice. So I would
Right.
say that they were all being raped, regardless of whatever their desire or participation. But for free women of color, there definitely was a segment who were volitionally engaging in procuring white males for economic benefit. Would you say that was the case?
I mean, ultimately, I don't know what their motive is, but there are people who benefit economically because of those relationships. I don't know if that's why they went into them because I can't figure that part out. But yeah, they definitely obtain things through those relationships. Um, yeah,
Interesting. Wow. Interesting.
Well, this has been fascinating. I want to thank Professor Miltier Jr. I didn't forget the junior. It's written very large on the book. For taking time to talk with us today. Will you have time to come with us into the champagne room, or is it past your bedtime?
how long are y'all in the champagne room?
We don't have to go super long. I actually have house guests, so I can't stay too long.
All right.
You
Well,
can do
yeah,
20 minutes in the champagne room.
yeah, I can do that.
Because I know Pascal wants to have a bigger discussion about class. I called Pascal up early for me. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. You know what's funny, Pascal? I call you up at early in the morning, and you do call me early as shit too, and you totally forget that I'm 3 hours behind you.
That does happen.
Either that, or you just give no fucks. I think it's a little bit of a combination of both. But
Professor Milton, I really want to thank you for coming on. This was so educational, and I hope you'd be willing to come on again. Give us the title of your books, please.
Yeah. So the book that's most recent is Beyond Slavery Shadow: Free People of Color in the South, and I also have a book, North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885.
oh, by the way, I couldn't get the download, so I bought it.
Yeah, and speaking of buying it, if you go directly to the presses, you can get a discount.
So,
UNC Press published one, and LSU Press published the other.
so I actually I didn't take advantage of my status as a media professional, and I bought it because I was having hella issues. I don't know if it was just my devices, but I bought it. So I just want you to know.
I appreciate that.
I hope everyone enjoyed. I hope everyone enjoyed our first iteration of an official Black History Month.
Last year we talked about no. I think we talked about everything, but was it
Yeah,
on purpose?
no, we were talking about having all of this black, super black, shaft black programming for Black History Month, and we did none of it.
I mean, I did make a Bill Cosby video essay, but I invited light skinned people on to talk about it.
Blasphemy.
That's why I did that. It's all part of the bigger picture. Oh, and by the way, for people that are talking about my tuning, if you can see this, you can see that. I don't know if you can
No.
see it because of these are my strings. If you really want to tune low, drop F sharp, you got to hit me up about my custom gauge strings, 74 to 13. And on that note, thank you guys for watching. Saturday morning, we will have Toy Galaxy's Dan Larson, author and professor Dr. Michael Harris, and we're going to talk about science fiction and the left, using science fiction as grand narratives to help grow the left. And Tuesday, we'll have Adolph Reed in to discuss his new book.
The South.
And And that's all I know off the top of my head about the schedule. And on that note, we are